very warm welcome to everyone for this Friday breakfast. And as always, thank you all very much for joining us today as we discuss an important topic on economy and regulatory perspectives, economic measures to revive global food security. I think we all know that an increasing number of countries are facing growing levels of food insecurity, reversing years of development gains, and even before COVID-19, reduced incomes and disrupted supply chains. So we have seen, chronic and acute hunger were on the rise due to various factors: conflicts, socioeconomic conditions, natural hazards, climate change. And again, the impacts of COVID-19 have led to severe and widespread increase in global food insecurity, affecting mostly vulnerable households in almost every country. With this, I wish you all a fruitful discussion, an interactive discussion. Thank you very much and looking forward.
Wish you a warm welcome to this important discussion. First of all, for those who are not familiar with the EPRN is the Economic Policy Research Network. We are mostly working with networking, research and training, and we are grateful for the partnership we have with IFPRI. We organize these important discussions that happen on a monthly basis. So let me wish you a very warm welcome and for a fruitful discussions with our participants.
Dr. David is a senior research fellow at the International Food Policy Research Institute. He joined IFPRI in 2004 and is currently based in Kigali, Rwanda, where he leads the Rwanda Strategy Support Program. David's research agenda covers a range of topics, including agriculture and rural development policy, agricultural science, technology and innovation, plant genetic resources and seed systems, agriculture extension and advisory services, and community-driven rural development. We're very happy and graced to be joined by David with his great experience and exposure on both conducting policy-relevant research and communicating evidence to stakeholders in public policy through strategy collaborations. And David, you're very welcome, and we are very much looking forward to hearing from your expertise.
Right, we know that the world is not on track to eliminate hunger and malnutrition because of various challenges. Even with the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, squarely in front of us, we know that there have been recent shocks, and we'll talk more about those related to COVID-19, but also in some countries, not all, but in some countries, insufficient progress in reducing undernourishment, micronutrient deficiencies, insufficient progress in improving diet quality, and ultimately insufficient progress in ensuring that people lead healthy and productive lives. We've seen shocks of a number of different kinds and sources that have affected GDP growth per capita, as well as more dire situations such as displacement of people caused by war and weather events and climate change and all sorts of other factors. At the same time, we know that Rwanda is one of the outstanding countries that is making progress towards its SDG goals and its national goals, both for agriculture, but also for health and for the overall social and economic transformation of the country. Unfortunately, COVID-19 was a very, very stark reminder of the frightening power of global shocks, right? The graph in front of you is simply through April 1st, the number of COVID cases that we've seen in Rwanda, and you can see a distinctive double hump here indicates two waves of serious spikes in infection. Rwanda stands out among the top 10 countries in the world that has managed the COVID-19 pandemic very, very well, with good testing, tracing, and containment policies. But of course, it's impossible to escape the economic impact of those policies and of the pandemic more generally. As a result, Rwanda's economy grew in 2020 by negative 3.4%. In other words, it contracted, and we experienced a recession here. Across the sectors, you all know that services and industry took the largest hit. Agriculture actually was able to sustain itself at a 1% growth rate, which, given everything that's occurred, was very, very encouraging. So one of the big messages that I think a lot of us have thought about when the COVID-19 shock occurred, dating back to March 2020, was that the first and most immediate reaction of many countries was to start closing borders. Now, closing borders for public health reasons is clearly a necessary function. Closing borders to trade becomes a risk factor. So for many reasons, trade restrictions can lead ultimately to higher food prices, especially in countries that also depend on imports, and Rwanda is one of them. During the COVID-19 shock over the past year, different households experienced the shock differently. And of course, I think that is obvious to everybody, but many different types of households exist in a country. And understanding where the shock lands and who is more affected is really important. And I think with COVID-19, for many of us working in agriculture and rural development, the first response was, oh my goodness, the farmers, the small farmer is going to suffer. Recovery efforts will require creativity in public policy and investment. It's an important point to keep in mind. Business as usual is clearly not going to be sufficient for this situation. And we know that public policy can enable the growth of game-changing ideas. And this may be the moment to think about game changers. And some of those boil down to ideas like expanding the flexibility of social protection programs in countries like Rwanda to pivot and to move towards where need is greatest. And if it's small-scale farmers who have been exposed to the shock most acutely, then pivot in that direction. If it's the urban poor, pivot in that direction. The key is to have flexibility so that these programs can respond quickly. There's a lot of innovation going on in the financial services sector. And part of that relates to the third point, digital financial services and digitizing agricultural value chain operations. Conventional public investment still matters. There is still a role for the things governments do day in and day out. And for every 100 game-changing ideas, there are still 5 or 10 essential government functions that we need to continue to see and to have operate. And that includes protecting the competitiveness of markets so that people can buy and sell with each other. There's also a really big opportunity at this moment to think about a radical shift in our thinking about food and nutrition. If there's one game-changing idea that I would promote or suggest that we think more deeply about, is food systems and the movement away from what I call, or what my colleagues have called, food staple fundamentalism, to something that is more nutritionally sensitive, nature positive, and gender transformative. On the natural resource and environment side, we all know that our environments and our natural capital are at risk. Climate change, and in the long term and in the short term, things like disease emergences such as COVID-19. But action lags behind our understanding of the problem. And as I said earlier, we should expect black swans and climate and other environmental shocks to increase in frequency and consequence going into the future. That's why we talk about nature positive food systems and multi-pronged approaches to that problem. COVID-19 has exacerbated inequalities, with vulnerable groups being most affected, and that includes women, youth, workers and laborers, and many other groups that are vulnerable, some of which we know, some of which we didn't really understand going into this crisis. We need to continue investing in social protection, in multiple approaches to social protection, and we need to figure out how to make them more adaptive, flexible, and scalable in the face of crisis. Food supply chains are an interesting issue that we're also thinking about in the context of COVID-19, and that I'm sure you're thinking about. In Rwanda, we were fortunate that many of our food supply chains were not interrupted by the restrictions placed on mobility and transportation and movement. But of course, there were some effects, and it took time to adjust to the restrictions. But globally, we did see, of course, a massive slowdown in logistics around trade and whatnot. So the effects were very serious, and they call into question some of the logistics and supply chain structures that we have in place, and the need to sort of proof them against future shocks, including better regulations, formalizing markets, adapting standards to new realities, and building up the capacity of small and medium enterprises. Because that's where, especially in Rwanda, a lot of the action and a lot of the consequences of COVID-19 were felt at the SME level. Finally, resilience. Resilience planning is something very difficult to think about. How do we actually plan for unknown uncertainties, multiple and more frequent shocks, disease, climate, financial shocks, conflict, and so on and so forth. Part of that comes from investing in information systems like FuseNet that provides us with early information on weather and climatic shocks. But it also goes back to this question of household capacity to absorb shocks or cope with shocks, and to access social protection and other public services and products to help them weather the storm. So I think I've made the points here very clear. Social safety nets, access to financial services, competitive functional markets, those long-term investments, R&D and infrastructure and education are all essential. And understanding a nutritionally sensitive, nature positive, and gender transformative approach to food system transformation is, at least in my mind, sort of what underlies or ties together all of these issues. That will take a lot of innovation. Not necessarily big game-changing ideas, but even small and incremental changes to what we do on a day-to-day basis. The pandemic offers an opportunity to strengthen the position and capacity of developing countries to participate in systems governing the ownership and the use of things like intellectual property rights, right? Or things like new ideas and new ways of organizing production processes or businesses, or things like that. There's going to be a lot of work that's necessary to get. So in summary, in Rwanda and throughout the world, we think we see the beginnings of a global food systems transformation as we come to recognize all of these factors that I just talked about. Shocks will still occur. They will occur with greater frequency in the future and probably greater severity and consequences. So social protection and safety nets remain critical in all countries. Public policy will play a key role in food systems transformation. Those essential, everyday, long-term public investments will still matter at all levels. And even if there are game-changing innovations that can add to that, let's not forget the importance of public investment in the long-term day-to-day work that needs to be done. And also recognize that with game-changing innovations, some will succeed, some will fail, and it's our role, especially as policy researchers, to evaluate and understand and learn from success and failure, and to allow for success and failure moving forward.
We know that these policies in Rwanda are already in place. We have a VUP, the Vision 20 Umurenge program. The government has a clear policy on this, on how to support the social protection. I'm asking, are these enough or not enough? Are they enough or perhaps not well implemented? He said there is needed a policy for food system transformation. I know the Minagri has the policy about food transformation. We are using now mechanization. What can be done in addition to have really a well-transformed agriculture?
To understand whether public policy is working, we need obviously good monitoring and evaluation. For Rwanda to get to the point where it has enough evidence, formative and summative evidence, that its various programs and schemes and policies are actually working at the ground level, you really need a credible research or analysis ecosystem that supports government. It requires, open debate and conversations, as well as, debate and conversations behind closed doors about policies that are working or not working, and applying those, applying the skills and capabilities of that ecosystem to the evaluation of social protection programs like the VUP, or the introduction of new agricultural technologies.
Does IFPRI and other food organizations think about the reduction of taxes on food imports and exports as a strategy of resolving global food insecurities?
I think the global trade in food, especially staples like rice, wheat, and maize, but also other foods, is important. It creates opportunities for Rwandan farmers and the farmers in other countries, and it creates opportunities for consumers. And in times of shock, these international markets can be really important to moving food to countries that need it, and to creating opportunities for farmers in countries that have food to export. It costs far too much for African countries to trade with each other, and in many cases, it's actually easier to import foods from the international market, from places like the United States and Europe and Russia and elsewhere. The point is that, this requires good analysis. It requires us understanding how that supply chain works and what the costs and returns to all of these activities in the economy are.
I'd like to ask how IFPRI fight against the climate change as it affects agriculture harvest, which drives to the food access to all.
So climate change is for all of us, I think, a very, very big topic of research. It goes hand in hand with understanding the effect of shocks on productivity and welfare, on nutrition and on consumption. There are three things we do. One is sort of, the high level thinking. The other thing we do is forward looking. So, we build computational models to help countries and governments and the global community think about issues such as where should public investments be made? Where do they have the highest return, not just on GDP growth, but also on poverty, on employment, and on diet quality, and on, of course, international trade. And the third thing we really do is the evaluation of impacts. Not the evaluation of projects, but the evaluation of the impact of a project.
There is still a long way to go to really achieve food security. And I would say that the global, target to achieve food security by 2030 is quite ambitious, and it requires, all stakeholders, all sectors to play a role. And I think it's really of paramount importance for everybody to think, what is my contribution? If I'm in communication, if I'm in marketing, if I'm in, which industry that you are active in, I think it's a great takeaway that I'm personally taking from this conversation.
Thank you very much, Yvette, for chairing, and thank you, Jean-Claude, for organizing this, and to Seth and Eileen and the rest of the team. Thank you for this wonderful opportunity. And especially as members of the Economic Policy Research Network of Rwanda, EPRN, it is our belief, it is our commitment to ask those questions and to seek answers and to create evidence, to communicate that well. Thank you very much.
We can do everything, but food will always be a human right, an important need in our lives. And I think there is a need for investment in agriculture. Paradigm shift on what and how we perceive food security and its alignment with nutrition. And the big question remains on how we implement policies and the programs that respond to the issues of food security. And again, who are the actors? Not only the government, but also, civil society organizations. So I also believe that there is a need to have more youth and women in this agriculture sector. So with all of this, we want to thank you so very much, Dr. David, for such a great presentation, for sharing your wisdom on this important topic. Thank you, Yvette, for leading us through this. And thank you so very much. Thank you, my colleagues from FES and EPRN. And this marks the end of this conversation. Thank you very much.